So we're doing a series on weariness, exploring where it comes from. Now, since we're talking about all this in the context of kingdom business, I thought it would be interesting to look in scripture and see what it says. Novel idea, right? Now, of course, you engineer software types will understand that once you start a word search, and then you start to look at all the variants, and then you start to consider multiple transitions or translations, then you can quickly turn all that into an infinite recursive loop. Now, not a doom loop, mind you, because you can keep looping on scripture forever and still get good stuff. But for our sake, I focused on a few translations, and the word weary appears 29 times in the NIV, 22 times in the New Living Translation, the NLT, and about 12 of those were unique. I also searched for weariness in those, plus a few more translations. There were just a few verses there. Now, I'm not sure I got any earth-shattering ahas from the exercise, but I did find some clues that will play into our next two segments of context. And that is how to navigate through your own weariness, and then how to lead your team through weariness, or prevent it in the first place. Now, you can go to my blog at atworkasinheaven.com for all the meat on this study, for all the scriptures that I used in this study. And you can also subscribe to my email list on the website, and you'll get those blog entries delivered right to your inbox. No fuss, no muss. But to summarize what I found, it seemed to me that when scripture refers to a group of people or to a specific person being weary, you can kind of categorize those references into three basic buckets. And the first of those is physical weariness. For example, in Deuteronomy 25:18, the people are weary and worn out from the journey. They're physically weary. In Joshua 7:3, they're weary in battle, weary from the fighting. In 1 Samuel 14:28, the men are weary and faint due to Saul's foolish command that the army not eat. Now, in contrast, Isaiah 40:31 says, those who hope in the Lord will run and not grow weary. I'm sure you're familiar with that verse in its fullness. Now, another big bucket of weariness is emotional weariness. And a few examples there include 2 Samuel 17:2, where David is weary from betrayal. In Psalm 119:28, the author says, my soul is weary with sorrow, another emotional consideration. In Job 7:3, he says, I too have been assigned months of futility, long and weary nights of misery. So futility causes weariness. In Psalm 57:6, the author says, my enemies have set a trap for me. I am weary from distress. So distress causes weariness. In Proverbs 25:25, it's too much bad news. Like cold water to a weary soul is good news from a distant land, inferring that too much bad news rather than good news causes weariness. Now, a few of those seem pretty relevant for the events of our day today, don't they? And so then the final category that it seemed to me that these causes fall into when we're talking about people, there's a spiritual weariness. For example, in Deuteronomy 28:64, it says, an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart for people that have turned away from the Lord's decrees. In other words, there's a weariness that comes from rebelling against God. In Isaiah 46:1, false gods are called a burden for the weary. In Isaiah chapter 50, verse 4, the Lord has given the prophet a well-instructed tongue to know the work that sustains the weary. In other words, the word of the Lord sustains the weary. That follows that the lack of the word of the Lord causes or furthers weariness. In Jeremiah 9:5, it says they weary themselves with sinning, and that's in the context of lying and deceiving. And in 2 Corinthians 5:2, it says we grow weary in our present bodies and we long to put on our heavenly bodies. In other words, we're not made for this world. We're living in a fallen world, and that'll make you weary. Now, one interesting discovery I made, well, I guess I knew this, but I hadn't really thought of it this way. But even God gets weary, he says. Well, kind of. In Isaiah 1:14, God says, your new moon feasts and your appointed festivals I hate with all my being. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. Now, the Hebrew word translated weary there is Strong's 38:11, if you're using a concordance, and that means to be weary or to have your patience tried. Now, another reference, and there were several of these, but another reference, Isaiah 43:24, the Lord is wearied by a great quantity of offenses from the people. And there, that's the Hebrew word, the word that's translated is Strong's 30:21. Now, on the other hand, we go to Isaiah 40:28, and he says, have you never heard, and a lot of you have heard this verse, have you never heard, have you never understood? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of all the earth. He never grows weak or weary. And that's the exact same Hebrew word, Strong's 30:21, as it just was in Isaiah 43:24. So now I'm no theologian, but I think I get what God's saying. It's the same thing any functional, loving parent has experienced, as opposed to a dysfunctional or abusive parent, right? I mean, you love your kids, but sometimes they just wear you out. At the same time, for the rest of forever, you love them, and you're so grateful to be their parent, and you wouldn't trade them for anything in the whole world, and you'll never get tired of being their parent. Well, until next week. And they're killing me. I need a break. I think we know what God is saying in the contrast of these two verses. Maybe a cleaner way of saying it is that even in his long-suffering, impossibly patient mercy, and his incomparably extravagant grace, even God sometimes grows weary of his rebellious, unrepentant, stubborn, self-serving kids. But he never grows weary of being God. So here's another interesting discovery to consider. A few examples in Scripture where someone should have been weary, but they weren't. For example, in 1 Kings 19, Elijah wants to lay down and die. He's done. But after an angel delivers him 2 simple meals of just bread and water, he goes hiking for 40 days and nights on the strength of those meals in the wilderness, not a walk in the park. And then in John 4:32, in the story of the Samaritan woman at the well, the disciples urged Jesus to eat, presuming he must be weary from the long journey. But Jesus says, I have food to eat you know nothing about. So maybe these examples of someone who should have been weary but wasn't are kind of giving us a clue here. That while our weariness could well be coming from the natural world, from physical stresses or emotional stresses or even spiritual stresses, the most powerful solutions may well come from the supernatural. And along that line of reasoning, a few more examples to consider include Jeremiah 31:25, where God brings refreshment. He says, I will refresh the weary and satisfy the faint. Or in Matthew 11:28, and this is Jesus talking, and many of you heard this verse too, where he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Well, that's probably enough on weariness. Maybe you're getting weary just talking about being weary. So next up in this series, we're going to start exploring solutions. First, how do we navigate through our own weariness? And then, as a leader, how do I help my team, or how do we help our teams navigate through the weariness, or simply avoid it in the first place? All right, thanks for following along. Be blessed.